So I'll just introduce Teresa to all of us. The Reverend Dr. Teresa Burnett-Cole is the coordinating minister at Glebe St. James Church in Ottawa, and I'm fortunate to work with her. She is the Indigenous representative for the General Council Executive of the United Church and serves as liaison with the National Indigenous Council of the United Church. Teresa was born in London, Ontario, and grew up living in a small town nearby. She studied percussion at Western University and then Canadian History and Religious Studies at King's University College. Teresa completed her Master of Divinity at Emmanuel College. Hot off the presses, Teresa has just defended her THD thesis in liturgical studies at the Toronto School of Theology. That was just last week. She has served congregations across the country. Teresa is an accomplished visual artist and musician. She has a passion for both creative liturgy and social justice. Her strong sense of humor and self-deprecating jokes make worship a true celebration of life. Teresa works hard to support the passions and energy of congregation members and pursues activist work in support of First Nations and queer people. After 12 years of ministry, Teresa still can't believe that she gets to do this for a living. She can't believe she gets paid for the honor of walking with people in the very best and worst times of their lives. Teresa is married to Ruth Burnett-Cole, and they live with their Jack Russell Terrier, who's known as Augie the doggy. So Teresa, I would like to offer you this tobacco.
Like which?
And I ask you to share your insights on how Indigenous people can teach settler churches to explore their spirituality and walk in right relations. So I'm passing it to you virtually. And, and as you've requested, I will release the tobacco onto the land and share it with creation following our discussion tonight.
Like which?
Before we begin, I will just remind us that after Teresa's presentation, we will have an open question period. Please save your questions until then. You'll be invited to ask questions using the reactions, raise hands button at the bottom or in the chat, which will be enabled at that point. So Teresa, please begin.
Thank you. I chuckled when I thought it's time for us to update our church webpage, which is where that bio came from, because I've now been ordained 19 years. We're in our 9th year working together, Glebe St. James United and the ministry team there. So as Sue just said, I just defended the thesis, and it was a 15-year trip. And one of the external examiners said, but that's the thing about doing work on Indigenous issues. You can only move at the speed of trust. And that truly has been my experience during doing this. If you want the whole double-barreled title, it's called, the thesis is called Toward a Decolonial Liturgical Enculturation, an Indigenous Contribution to Intercultural Worship in the United Church of Canada. Now, how's that for a double-barreled handle? I didn't come up with it, my committee did. I got into doing this work largely because in 2006, the United Church committed itself to becoming an intercultural church. We didn't become an intercultural church. We said we were going to work on it. Since then, there have been an incredible number of studies and strategies for how we're going to go about this. But I have to be clear when I say that the idea of becoming an intercultural church is aspirational. We have all kinds of small changes that have been made, but largely intercultural worship is our growing edge. Actually, anything intercultural is our growing edge. What I find interesting is that although we've done lots of theology and biblical studies about intercultural concerns, there's been very little done about liturgy. So as a liturgist, when I was looking at where to go, I thought this would be helpful. It's kind of interesting because music and visual arts really are the low-hanging fruits of interculturality in worship, right? Music, the visuals we use, that's a low-level, easy fix. But getting further than that has been difficult. Think about the song Sia Hamba, right? We are marching in the light of God. I can guarantee that pretty much every United Church in the country knows Sia Hamba. The question is whether they will sing it in its original language or remain singing in English. That has been a tougher nut to break. If you take away one thing tonight from what I say, remember this. Most congregations in the United Church of Canada are completely unaware that their liturgical practices are largely European in design. It's just the way things are, and it's the way most of us have come to know Christianity. Front and center in the United Church these days, questions around racism, decolonization, and right relations are at the forefront of United Church concerns. And in this context, the Indigenous churches have a lot of wisdom to share by offering insights into the ways of mitigating cultural barriers. Christian worship, my friends, is not equivalent to European worship. Unfortunately, we tend to get stuck there. I based my work on a gentleman by the name of Ansgar Chipunko. And Ansgar was a Filipino monk, so a racialized person. And he argued persuasively that, okay, here comes big words, liturgical pluralism is an incarnational imperative. So what he was saying basically was Christ has to be born in each culture for Christianity to become truly indigenous to that culture, right? And he believed that every culture on the planet had the cultural tools, the stories, the symbols to express the Christian story. I set Dr. Chipunko's work alongside our context in Canada. I don't know whether you've thought much about Canadian culture. We do have a founding story or saga, and it tends to be sort of a swashbuckling saga of coureurs de bois and missionaries and lumberjacks. And that's the stories we teach our children to explore who we are as Canadians. And the subtext of that is we also justify our taming of the land. This is our cultural legacy. And I know it's really hard when you try to describe it, when we talk about what a colonial country is. In a way, we breathe Coleanity all the time. And it's kind of like a fish would have difficulty describing water. We too are mostly blind to the effects of Coleanity in our contemporary Christian society because it's just the water we swim in. The work I've done focuses on Anishinaabe stories or worldview. And the Anishinaabe offers a different perspective on creation, on culture. And I want to just highlight that I worked with this one set of nations. This is one story in a great many stories in Canada. And here's where things get interesting. As I studied various Anishinaabe United Churches, I found that members responded in three basic ways. Now, note that by about 200 years ago, most Indigenous people in southern Canada were Christian. Most were evangelized between about the 1830s to 1850s, and it was largely done by Methodists and Catholic missionaries at that point in time. The Anglicans came in a little later, sort of cheek to jowl with the Methodists, and went north, where they had a huge impact. Now, when I looked at these churches, I grouped them in three different ways. I talked about Christo-traditional churches. Traditional is a messy word to use because both traditional spirituality folks or ceremonial spirituality folks claim the word traditional, and conservative Christians also can use that term. So the first group I talked about, I called them Christo or Christian traditionalists. And that's a form of Christianity that is startlingly similar to that of the early Christian colonial missionaries. Even now, when the missionaries are long since gone, these churches are maintaining the same foreign form that was brought to them by the missionaries, and they're imposing it on brand new generations. In the congregation I served on Beausoleil First Nation, they were staunchly, for the most part, Christian traditionalists. And that meant that they harkened back to really interesting pieces of Methodist history. Like I had never heard of a watch night service before I got there. And it turns out Methodists have a tradition of doing a service on New Year's Eve and literally praying in the new year. And it has very specific content to it. Another thing that was popular in the day was the tent meeting or the camp meeting. I didn't know what on earth they were talking about when the elders asked if I would please have a camp meeting. These folks believe that their form of Christianity is inspired, and they think it's authentic to their religious heritage. It may surprise you to know this, but they believe that the contemporary United Church is profoundly out of step with their understanding of what it is to be a Christian. When I first got to the island, they asked me, they said, Reverend, are there any real Christians out there? What they meant was, are there more traditionalist Christians out there? These folks have a couple of hallmarks. First of all, they believe that traditional spirituality is superstitious at best, and at worst, I love this quote. It's from John Webster Grant, a giant among United Church historians, who said traditional spirituality was a form of servitude and slavery to diabolical forces. We don't believe that anymore. These folk also believe that spiritual beliefs are passed on by the oral tradition. It's not dependent on the written word, although these folks have a deep love for scripture. In their culture, one's grandparents or parents teach spiritual and ethical behavior. And one of the primary cultural teachings is respect for one's parents. To dishonor one's heritage is to dishonor one's heritage means you're literally turning your back on your heritage. And where this catches them is They then believe, as a corollary, to shift or change spiritual beliefs is to dishonor their relatives. The emphasis on the sanctity of orality keeps their teachings quite traditional. Now, there are some benefits to it. One of the amazing things I found was they do a remarkable job of maintaining the language, because quite often they sing in Anishinaabe, in one of the dialects. In a lot of Anishinaabe United Churches, if not all the time, a portion of the time they can say the Lord's Prayer in Nish. The second group of Indigenous folk are what I've called the ceremonial people. And I use the word ceremonial rather than traditional because it's the word they've asked me to use. And they believe that all of life is rooted in ceremony. These folks have maintained, very few, but some have maintained their traditional spiritualities, or they've returned to those life ways. In the communities I worked with, the Medewan Lodge, or the Grand Medicine Lodge, was the primary spirituality. And Midday, Wewin, basically means the good heart or the good sound everywhere. Their ceremonies are largely a series of healing practices. Restoring balance and maintaining order is a huge part of their life way. Some scholars have commented that return to these ceremonial spiritualities is really the ultimate expression of dissatisfaction with Christianity. And it's kind of interesting. When I studied the historical part of this, I was amazed to see how closely in a lockstep the Medewan Lodge was with groups like the Red Power movement, the political groups, the American Indian movement, those sorts of sovereignty works. In fact, AIM and the Medewan share not founder isn't the word, but an establishing presence in the person of Eddie Benton Benet, who was an incredibly formative leader who just passed away a couple of years ago. This is a place of incredible spiritual resurgence. It's a return to the values and ceremonies of old. It really is considered to be one of the best approaches for cultural survival. And it's interesting because the young people are coming in flocks, right? They've distanced themselves from the churches and are taking up what they see as their ceremonial spirituality as being a best way forward. Even the ceremonialists, though, have had an impact by Christianity. It's affected their cosmology. For example, there is a whole series of stories about the Great Flood. Sound familiar? It's not too surprising because the Anishinaabe worldview is an incorporative one. It builds in whatever is part of its experience. So Christianity has become part of that world, and therefore echoes of scripture have been incorporated into the world view. And it's interesting because one of the places I saw this most clearly was during an initiation ceremony into the Medewan, and the undertones of baptism were absolutely fascinating. You got to know that this group has been incredibly polarizing in communities. We still hear regular stories of the Medewan lodges being burnt, their cemeteries being desecrated. And it should be a sobering thought to us that now we're seeing the burning of our churches as well. So we're deemed as inadequate in some way. The third group is the group that really interests me, and I call them expansive intercultural communities of faith. And they're the folks who some of our more conservative members will level a charge of syncretism at, because they really do try to hold traditional symbolism and story alongside of Christianity. Even as late as the General Council meeting last summer, the charge of being pagans or syncretists were leveled at these Christians. But really, folks, we have done this kind of syncretism since the very early days of Christian worship. Think about the role of Judaism in the formation of our sacraments. Think of the ways the structures of our churches are founded in the Greco-Roman world. It's happened all along. So what they're doing is not different than anything else that's been done before. It is our decolonial edge. And it results in liturgical practices that have some unique hallmarks. And what I would say is that they are contextual, oral, relational, and spiritual. Okay? Contextual, oral, relational, and spiritual for those who are madly trying to write this down. By contextual, I mean that Indigenous faithways are not static. They're living and they're adaptive. To try and trap them in the pages of a history book just doesn't cut it, because they are continually forming and reforming themselves, just like Christianity does. I say that they're contextual because they're based on the land, the notion that the land is sacred, and that we are simply a part of creation, and we're called to care for it, not in a stewardship kind of way, but as one being in a family of beings. Yeah, enough about that for now. The second thing is that Indigenous worship is oral. You know, oral, and understand that oral communication is not merely a stepping stone on the way to literacy. It's not more primitive. It's a different way of organizing one's oral communication. They rely far more on storytelling. And if you've ever had the pleasure of listening to an Indigenous person tell stories, you know how alive and how visceral they are. What you need to know is that these stories aren't just stories. They're actually mnemonic devices. Storytellers have incredibly well-trained memories, and they don't need the text to keep them on track. It's actually brilliant. They combine history and myth, rhyme and rhythm, songs and chants to move the verbal communication along. What I found fascinating is not all storytellers know the same stories. And in a lot of communities, certain families or certain groups had responsibility for maintaining certain stories. And in a number of Anishinaabe communities, knowledge about healing, certain plants, for example. It's a brilliant communal way of sharing knowledge, but it also has an incredible problem. And the church has exacerbated that problem by the work that we've done to try and break down traditional ceremonial practices, because you see, the loss of elders is critical. The number of elders that are around in communities is decreasing exponentially. And I heard someone describe it that to lose an elder at this point in time is to lose an entire library. So it's quite vulnerable. Third liturgical hallmark, if you will, is that Indigenous spiritualities are relational. We got to remember that God's covenant was with all of creation, which included all people. The Anishinaabe concept of Manitou, and it has a number of nations have a similar kind of approach. Manitou is like energy or spirit. So when you say that all of creation is suffused with Manitou, you're saying all of creation is woven through with God's energy or spirit. That's not just people. That's not just breathing beings. It's everything, right down to the rocks. And that's really interesting to me, because I mean, think about scripture where it says in Deuteronomy, you know, even the rocks shall cry out in witness. So ceremony for these folks is profoundly relational. It's about balance and maintaining right relationship between God and all of creation. The other thing, and this may not be comfortable for some to hear, Indigenous spirituality is a birthright. I heard one Anishinaabe fancy dancer talk about it, and he was asked about people who embrace Indigenous spirituality who are not Indigenous. And it was brilliant. He said, you know, they're looking for something, and they're welcome to come and journey with us for a while and try and sort that through. But in the long run, they need to find their own sacred path, the path of their culture and their community, because that's where they will hear most clearly God speak. So spirituality, friends, is a birthright. Last liturgical practice or hallmark of Indigenous spiritualities is that it's spiritual. God is the creator of everything and everyone. So every nation has their own stories. In the case of the Anishinaabe nations, they talk about the grandfather teachings. And that's a piece that's shared by a lot of other Indigenous communities as well. And the grandfather teachings are simply, not simply, wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. All their ceremonies are based on those realities, their ethical teachings on these realities. God speaks through dreams and visions. Does that ring a bell? Right? Throughout scripture, there are stories of dreams and visions. The important thing about Indigenous spirituality for you to understand is orthodoxy, or right belief, is far less important than balance and behavior. It's not what you believe, it's how you act and how you are in the world. Anishinaabe liturgy or worship is never static. All three approaches are what I would call decolonial. In other words, they're helping deconstruct that Western way of doing things. All three are working for change, and all three are very contemporary expressions of culture and worship. So what about takeaways for us? Well, I got a few. The Academy is big on best principles and practices. So in the conclusion of my thesis, I took a look at those. And there are lessons for churches as a whole. The first one is about welcoming. And it's self-evident when you think about it, but it takes courage to enter a church as a stranger. Welcoming matters. How it is we welcome people, giving them their space, but offering help. You know, a lot of people don't understand church language these days. And so any kind of visuals or oral prompts you can supply help the stranger in our worship. Furthermore, plain language is really important. We have a lot of churchese, church language. Think about it: preludes, postludes, anthems, benedictions, commissionings. What does that mean to the average person, right? Plain language helps not only visitors, but those who haven't had the long indoctrination that some of us have had in Christianity. Understand that strangers don't necessarily know our movements any more than they know our words. So ways of gently accompanying people are really important. So welcoming matters. Second, I want to talk a little bit more about language. You know, the words we use to name reality help create our world by allowing us to see and attend to what we would otherwise overlook. I had one prof who used to say, language forms and informs, right? It not only tells you about something, but it indoctrinates you into the practice of that thing. So our language in worship needs to be clear and straightforward. Plain language, again, as I said before. There is also an assumption of literacy in most Christian worship that disturbs me, because it excludes anyone for whom the written word is difficult. And that could be for non-English speakers or second language speakers, for children, for the visually challenged. I mean, think about all the people that are restricted by words. You know, we have a regular bulletin we publish at Glebe St. James every week. We also have a large print version, and we also have a version on the wall. And I know we're still missing groups, and trying to find ways to address that need is a constant challenge for liturgists. We need to be expansive in our images of God. It frightens me to know that inclusive language is having to be taught in our seminaries again. It's not something we can take for granted. It's something we have to continue to work on. And words for God are another example of that. You know, if we only refer to God as Father, Mother, Son, Spirit, think about how thin that is. Even when you consider Scripture, there's something like 140 names for the holy in Scripture. So, I mean, if we're only using 4 or 5, we're missing out. I've talked about keeping language simple. In announcements, this is really critical. You know, I had a prof once say, you know, announcements are either a movable feast or a dog's breakfast, right? There is no good place to put them in worship. They're disruptive no matter where you put them, but they're incredibly important, especially for those who are visiting, because it's our announcements that tell visitors what we really value. right? And if half your announcements are about balancing the budget, what are you telegraphing to those who are listening? And the announcements also need to be invitational. You know, we want people to come to worship. Do we also want them to participate in other ways? Think about the language that we're using. This is also an issue for church prep. How I would teach a university course and how I would speak in my pulpit are completely different animals. It's not that my congregation couldn't understand, it's that I'm worried about who I'm leaving behind when I assume that level of literacy. And there are problems with our church language. And one of the worst is the language of mission. And you're going to hear more about this in the coming months because the General Council is working on that. And a colleague, Teresa Samuel, and I have an article coming out in Broadview about that very stuff. Mission is language that is mired in violence. It's a problem for us. We need to come up with a new way of speaking about caring for God's creation. Next group, music and worship. You could have a whole session like this on music and worship. And there has been a ton written about intercultural music. But what I would want to say to you is think closely about the kind of music that you're using. They're more than cultural artifacts. You know, the music that we choose to use helps us to rejoice with those who are rejoicing and weep with the suffering. Choosing music for the worship leaders on the call requires incredible cultural humility. We're not striving for what C. Michael Hahn calls ethnotourism, you know, a trip across the globe every week. What we're striving for is to worship with Christians around the globe. And what we need to realize is that 2/3 of the world's Christians are not from the West. They're not from North America. They're not from Europe. They're in the 2/3 or the majority world. And it's high time we started to use their corpus in the way that they've been using the Western corpus. Use silence. That was an amazing tool I learned from the time I spent in various communities. Silence is really an effective tool. And remember, it's also cultural. You know, different cultures have varying degrees of tolerance for silence. Most United churches I've worked in can handle about 20 seconds of silence before they start to squirm in their pews. So it's an interesting project to try and expand that time for direct communication with the Holy. Think about the use of your choir. Do you have a choir? If so, are they off separate from the congregation? What would happen if you were to take, not every Sunday, you know, please, no music directors get after me, but occasionally you were to feed that choir through your congregation? What would that mean in supporting communal song? Think about, you know, the ways you could use that body of volunteers in a way that would best support your congregation. Next, congregational relationships. You know, relationships are the fundamental building blocks of culture. You know, we believe that all are made in the image of God. We're interrelated, therefore everyone has a place. It requires really deep humility and a commitment to close listening to foster those relationships. As I said at the beginning, it takes time, and it always takes longer than you've allotted for. Just know it. That's the reality. The truth telling is really critical to our relationships. And truth telling has two parts. First of all, and this is a part for those who are in positions of power in the churches, it's really important that truth be named by you who have social or political power. It's important that we acknowledge we don't have all the answers. That's an incredibly powerful message for those who are in the minority to hear. Second, truth-telling requires action. I mean, think about the residential schools. There are three sort of pieces around truth-telling. First, we need to acknowledge what happened, which, for example, in the case of residential schools is horrendous. Two, you have to engage in repentance and commit to actions of justice. Third, don't prematurely ask for forgiveness. Be willing to sit in the discomfort and the humility. That's the problem with the apologies we've made in the United Church. We've made apologies, but they haven't been accepted. And the reason is no actions of justice, and it was premature. It wasn't the time to do it. The next thing I'm going to talk about is cultural appropriation. And this one, I mean, people are making big bucks on talking about cultural appropriation. What I'd want to say to you is liturgy should be models for peace, justice, and wholeness. And that takes time. Laying one culture alongside the gifts of another is an ongoing and slow process. And you have to be willing to review your own culture and continually question the intentionality of using materials from other cultures. Why are you using it? Pay attention to your own cultural bias, because I guarantee you, you have one. I know I do. Are there other people from the culture in your midst? That's an important question. Or is what you're doing a moment for education of the congregation? Also a legitimate reason to use material from other cultures. Are you setting the church in its context? Are you helping them understand the Canadian context? And as you ask those questions, be prepared to deal with backlash, be prepared to deal with cultural discomfort. That dissonance is a critical part of learning to appreciate other cultures. And finally, leadership. You've really got to make sure that the liturgical space is a safe place, which means, for example, you don't smudge without someone who is tasked with that cultural task. Otherwise, it doesn't feel safe for people. And there are more questions than there is benefit. The other piece I would say, nothing about us without us. It's really great to bring in speakers. I would say it's critical to have conversations. But more than, for example, on June 21st, when we gather on, on Indigenous Sunday, rather than just inviting a speaker, encourage them to be part of the planning of the entire service so that you get the insights woven through your liturgy instead of superimposed in the conversation. So finally, just a few general comments. Liturgy has to be more than a message for our brains and our senses. It has to touch our spirits. And that requires good hearts and motives when we go to reimagine our worship. We need to focus, I would suggest, on conciliation rather than on reconciliation. We have to build relationships before we can speak of repairing what's broken. And unfortunately, in most of our United churches, there's very little contact with Indigenous folk. And one thing I've heard over and over again from Indigenous people is, You come see us. Don't expect us to come see you all the time. It's important on a lot of levels. Remember, friends, that when we're looking at Indigenous tools for worship, we're not trying to build a universal model here or even a pan-Canadian model here. We're seeking a diversity of voices, not a synthesis, right? Finally, intercultural worship is an act of solidarity with Christians worldwide, and that includes our Indigenous brothers and sisters. They're doing the same work. The task of this season of the church's life is deep listening. And my question to each of you is, are you ready to do that deep listening? Are we, as the United Church of Canada, ready to do that work? Are we prepared to let go of cherished rituals to make space for others? Because no one should feel like a guest in their liturgical home. And I'll leave it there. Sue, are you coming back?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Teresa. It's Jay Sonley speaking. And
Hi, James.
we have some moments for questions now. And just in preparation for that, we're going to, because we have quite a few people who are attending, and to manage them, we're going to ask you to, everyone, when they ask their question or want to ask a question, to raise their electronic hand. I'm sure everyone knows how to do that, but just to review, it's in the reaction section. You look at the icons at the bottom of your screen, and you see reactions. When you click on that, and then you're offered the opportunity to raise your hand. And one of the three of us who are trying to organize and keep the questions going will speak to you and tell you to unmute your mic and to ask the question of Dr. Reverend Teresa. So
That's
just
a mouthful.
another thing that we're anxious to have people do is keep your questions short and to the point. There's a lot of people and there are likely to be quite a few questions. So we'd like to be able to answer as many as we can. We're not likely we'll get to them all, but that's the way things are.
And I see Nathan has a
Yes.
question from Kofi.
And,
Yes, I do. The question was in French, and as a faithful translator, here it goes in English. He asks, he mentions a form of prayer that is related in the New Testament, in the Acts and the Epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, speaks of prayer in language, or better still, in glossolalia. I had to look that one up. This is still practiced in the Pentecostal churches. According to my research, it would seem that this practice existed well before Jesus Christ, namely by the Inuit, when the head of the household would pray in his language, bringing healing to the sick. I would like to know if this has been verified. Thank you.
Indeed, in Indigenous cultures, they sing in what's called non-vocables. So sometimes the songs are a particular language, but quite often they're what's considered a spirit language, and they come straight from the heart. So yes, Kofi, that is part of worship in many communities.
I don't see a great number of hands. I know that Sue
sorry, I probably need to translate this back for Kofi.
Okay.
Alors, Kofi, Teresa nous fait dire que ça existe dans plusieurs langues autochtones et dans plusieurs rituels et pratiques également, puisque Dans plusieurs de nos chants et de nos rituels, ce sont des sons tout simplement qui sont menés par l'esprit et non pas nécessairement des paroles qui ont une signification quand on prie. Alors oui, ça existe dans plusieurs de nos cultures autochtones.
Merci beaucoup.
Et plaisir.
Now we have Arlise, who has a question. Arlise, you could unmute your mic and ask your.
Thank you. This is probably a question and an observation. For a number of years now, the worship desk at General Council has offered templates for worship on the June 21st Sunday. And they have evolved to being those worship services that are for Indigenous communities and for non-Indigenous communities. I'm just curious how many congregations use those, either, partially or totally, and how well they are received, especially as you noted, many congregations do not have that opportunity for conciliation with Indigenous, Métis, First Nations, Inuit close by.
Trying to raise my hand.
Okay, I appreciate your question, Arliss. One of the reasons we have those two different things now is because one of the things I realized when I was in Indigenous ministries was most of our worship materials made no sense to our Indigenous churches, because quite often those services talked about residential schools and were penitential in nature. That's not the story that our Indigenous communities need. The Indigenous Day, June 21st, is for many communities a day of great celebration. I know on the island, every group had something going that day, and it was an incredible celebration. It was difficult as the United Church minister to have a service that would be appropriate for those days. So that's the gap that they're aiming for. And I strongly encourage people who, as you quite rightly pointed out, don't have the relationships available to them to at least start with those services. You'll note if you look through the services that they're usually written by Indigenous folk. I hope that answers it, Arliss.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Reverend Nancy Best, I see you have your hand up, and I believe you have your mic already unmuted, so go ahead.
Yes, I just want to make a comment because I was the person who wrote the service for the Indigenous Sunday for last year. And
Indeed.
I tried to make it inclusive to all people and kind of a gentle understanding of what our spirituality is, and yet incorporating our language and some of our teachings. And my goodness, I was totally astounded at how many people wrote back to say that they had used the whole service or portions of it. And I know that people still refer back to it and use portions of it. It was a reaction that I had not expected and just felt incredibly honored by. And yes, I am Indigenous.
And you did a beautiful job, my Mohawk sister.
Miigwech.
No one.
Thank you, Reverend Best. I don't see any other hands up, but I know that you, Sue Toller, had a question that you wanted to ask.
Hi again, Teresa. Well,
Hi.
I think the question I have is what you were throwing back at us, but I'll throw it back at you again, maybe. you work in a church and you're an active member of the National Executive of United Church. So do you find that people are interested in the gifts of Indigenous spirituality and some of the things you've mentioned this evening? Like, how open do you think we are to changing some of our traditions and bringing in others?
I actually find the United Church to be incredibly open. If anything, I think because of the TRC function, there's an incredible hunger for knowledge about this. Sometimes it feels like the focus is only around residential schools, and that's an important focus, and I'm not, saying it isn't. But we tend not to see the giftedness in the worship ways of our brothers and sisters, and I think that's an incredible loss.
Thanks very much. I see that Carol Scott has her hand up. Carol, you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Jay.
Hi, Carol.
With my volume here, just a second.
Give it a try.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Nope,
my
okay.
computer is kind of wonky. I'm just wondering, going back to the TRC call to action number 59, do you think that sometimes we're wanting to race ahead without decolonizing ourselves in terms of education of the entire congregation, going back to looking at the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius and so on, that sometimes we want to do the right thing without really having a good sound educational understanding of what happened and all the whys and wherefore. For example, the book The Sleeping Giant Awakens is one book that kind of lays it all out in a sequential fashion. So I'm just asking, do we really need to be doing a lot more congregational education before we try to put in I don't know what I'm saying here, before we try to be more inclusive? Or is it a chicken and an egg thing?
Well, I'll tell you, my thesis was 368 pages long, and 98 pages were about history, trying to weave together, in this case, just the Anishinaabe history with the history of liturgy and enculturation. I think it's a major issue. I did, as Susan said, Canadian history as an undergrad, and I focused on pre-Confederation Canadian history. After I was ordained, I went out to Saskatchewan, and I was looking around for Con Ed ideas, and I found out that the First Nations University, which is the only Indigenous university standalone in the country, was offering courses. And so I talked my way into their introduction to Indigenous history, and I was stunned because for 13 weeks I sat in that classroom, and other than a few names that I recognized, the material was completely different. And that was a huge telling for me. And I mean, one of the dreams I have now that I'm done the thesis is I'd love to get together a group of Indigenous writers from across the country to tell those stories from their regions and collect them together so that the United Church actually could start to do some of that educational work with their folks. Because as you say, The one about the sleeping giant is a good one. Um, there's a few books by Dickinson, Olivia Dickinson, who tries to offer a more comprehensive Indigenous history for the environment now known as Canada. There's also one called, I think it's From Our Sacred Mountain, which tells a story from the Alberta context. But we have a desperate need to teach our congregations the real story, the rest of Canadian history, if you will. I hope that answers, Carol.
Thank you.
Jane, yeah, you have, Jane Antiknap, you have a question. You can unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Teresa, so you and Carol have just been speaking about the fact that there's need, of course, for more continued education and deep listening, as you put it earlier. And I wonder, and I realize we don't want to get into this in great depth tonight, but very soon we'll be in our churches talking about dealing with the remit around the autonomous Indigenous church.
Oh, yes.
And do you see it as a bit of a challenge that, you know, we're doing this at a time when there hasn't been all that much education and not all that much exposure to Indigenous peoples, not much opportunity to build relationships?
Yes, this keeps me awake at night.
Sorry, I didn't.
No, that's okay. I was part of the team that wrote the proposal that came from the National Indigenous Council. And one of my duties on the General Council Executive is I serve as the Indigenous rep, which means I'm seconded to the National Indigenous Council and take part in their meetings as well. I really hope that the church is listening because there's a lot at stake here.
Mhm.
The United Church has offered the Indigenous Church an awful lot of words, a couple apologies, you know, support, acceptance of the calls to action. You know, we've, as a general council body, 2 councils ago, we accepted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Mhm.
There's an awful lot of words, but what the proposal says is, here's an opportunity for action. Give them the space that they need to do the work they're doing.
Mhm.
And I'm part of the team that's preparing the remit materials. In fact, they will be going out in March. They've got to be on the desk of the General Secretary by next week. And we found that we had to write a huge preamble to the educational piece in order to make sure that we had everybody on the same page.
Mhm.
What people don't realize, and this is what's so incredibly important, and if you can take anything back to your congregations, take this. If you don't vote on this, it is a vote no.
Well, okay, thank you for clarifying that, because people have been asking.
Yeah,
So if
so
you
it's really,
if you don't vote, it's a no vote.
that's right,
Okay.
which sets the bar very high.
Yes, indeed. Wow.
And I don't know what it'll say about the United Church if we can't manage to do this.
Mhm. Yes.
There's a lot of people watching.
Well, thank you, Teresa. I didn't mean to keep you awake at night.
No,
But I
no,
think it's important we hear this, and you're one of the people who can speak to it very directly. Thank you.
Well, we have the time and I'm glad to talk about it.
Could we just elaborate on that for a moment? Because there may be people on this call who don't know what we're talking about. Sorry, Robert, for holding off your question, but maybe you could just explain what that remit is to help people from different
Right.
congregations understand.
Sure. A remit is a formal church process that gives permission for something to happen that is what they call a denomination shaping decision. So because this will change the format of the United Church, we will have the National Indigenous Council as part of our structure. It requires the whole of the United Church to vote. And it's not individual people, it's actually the church councils and the regional councils that will be voting. But it's really important. There's a lot of things going on in our world. And, you know, if you're in a congregation where you're fighting for your existence, stuff like this can fall right off the radar. And it's quite important. Right now, the Indigenous Church is struggling to form itself within the United Church of Canada. I don't know what happens if that permission isn't granted for them to continue to do the work that they're doing. That worries me. Susan, does that help with an explanation of what's going on?
I think so. Are there other people? Maybe people could ask follow-up questions if they're not sure. There's a remit coming up this spring, is what Teresa's saying. It's about the overall organization of our United Church and how the National Indigenous Church is related to the overall organization, right? And the remit is about
Right.
giving permission to the National Indigenous Council to do the work it needs to do to structure itself, basically, right?
Correct. Correct.
Perhaps we can come back to that if we wish, but Robert
Yep.
Sims has been waiting very patiently with his question. Robert, you've unmuted, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Is the United Church aware of our antiquated language and services? Nothing, very little has changed in 500 or 600 years. It's, I mean, the Greek, even the Greek translations are a horror. Prayers of the Cosmos is a wonderful translation from Aramaic into English of both of the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes. They come alive. Thank you very much for all of this. Does the United Church pay attention to these to our Center for Christian Studies in Winnipeg?
Absolutely.
They have Friday seminars, and this latest one was a South Korean minister with the United Church. His family, his great-grandfather,
Mhm.
his great-grandfather became a Christian minister, which meant they were cut off from the incredible wealth and legacy of the church of spirituality and religions within Korea. And he has only reclaimed who he is by going back past his great-grandfather. It was a fascinating presentation of how far we have yet to go. It's scary what we're.
Yeah, and I understand.
And given the collapse of our congregations, why has the United Church not taken steps to hand the property back to the original inhabitants?
That's a very
what
good
I find
question.
really. I'm the one who wrote back to Broadview 2 years ago with the Mission Church in Alberta, which had raised God knows how much money, and I couldn't understand it then. I can't understand $950,000 condos going up at Southminster in a congregation that's blown it, and why wasn't the property handed over? And thank you very much. It's and David Graeber's book, recent book, History of Everything, which creates the enlightenment back into indigenous spirituality and thought within North America. How many people recognize that when white children were taken by the indigenous population, that when they're given the opportunity to return to their European families, every one of them said no, and they all returned to where they've been living. They turned their back on Europe.
Anyway, thank you very much, Robert.
Yeah, so
Teresa, did
apologies
you
for
wish
this. Thank you very
you
much.
wish to
I
speak to
appreciate
that?
it, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do you wish to speak to some of those thoughts?
Yeah, just a little bit. So, Robert, I appreciate that you've obviously studied. I would quibble a little bit about the not any changes in 600 years. If anything, the Protestant project has spiraled in a number of different ways. And I'm proud of the United Church and the work we've done. Does that mean we have a handle on everything? Oh, no, 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 no. But trying to make the liturgy alive is a really important thing. And for those of you who don't know this about United Church worship, we're part of what's called the Free Reform movement, which literally means there isn't a prescribed way of doing worship in the United Church. There are a number of options that are available, but each congregation has the freedom to evolve as they see fit. That's fascinating to me, and it's a level of freedom that a lot of denominations don't have. I would like to see us use it with a bit of creativity, and that was what the liturgical tools I offered were in pursuit of. Are there other?
I have a question, if I might impose on the rest
Sure.
of them. I'm quite intrigued by your conversation about silence and silence in the liturgy. That's very special. And I'm wondering how the Indigenous Church uses silence in the liturgy, and whether you could maybe speak just a little further as to how we might introduce that into our regular church liturgies.
Sure. It's interesting. I would say that the default in Indigenous communities is silence, not filling it up with words. My partner talks about a summer she spent up north, and she was there doing some youth work in the community. And in the evening, the adults would come and they would sit in silence for half an hour, 45 minutes. And she said at first, the people who were with her tried to fill the space because it seemed so profoundly uncomfortable. But as they allowed themselves to fall into it, they realized it's quite companionable. The silence is full. Whereas we think in the West that silence is empty. It's a lack of something. Silence is considered whole and rich. I'm about to do some experiments with my congregation in this, and I've purchased a chime. Sounds simple. As a way of, I'm going to try initiating silence and try to gradually lengthen the space as tolerance grows, so that you really are creating space for individual conversation with the holy that doesn't have to be scripted by someone else. So I'll let you know how it goes.
So in keeping with the thought, maybe we should have a little bit of silence while people contemplate another question.
Which saying he saw someone's hand up and went down again?
I think that was Carol, perhaps, and that she was going to be putting her hand down, but I'd already done that.
Ah.
Susan, are you ready to
Sure, I could
unmute?
go again.
I guess you're, is that the indication of your tolerance for silence?
That's right. I need to practice more. But I did want to ask Teresa, out of all the work she did, what was most surprising to you? Or maybe you had a few surprising things that you came upon, because you obviously have both, you have experience in Indigenous culture and in settler culture. So going into all this and working through it all, what did you find surprising?
I was surprised at how comfortable my worship experience with the Medewan was. And it came about, this is a bit of a story, but there was a murder in the community I was serving, and it was horrendous and it was shocking, and the community was having a really hard time. And one half of the family was Medewan, the other half was Catholic, and they couldn't agree on how to do the final rites for their brother. So they came to me and said, look, you're our United Church auntie. Will you help us? And I thought, okay, well, I don't have any skin in the game. We can do this. And it was fascinating because a Catholic priest, the leadership of the Medewan Lodge, and I worked together on the rituals. And at the end, Grand Chief Benton Benet invited me to come to Bad River, Wisconsin, to actually take part in their spring ceremonies. So I took a week off work, drove for 14 hours with another family, and found myself at this celebration. And at first I couldn't figure out what was going on because there was so many things happening at the same time. It wasn't like everybody went in the lodge and sat down for teaching at the same time. There were people off building the initiates lodge. There were people working on meals. There were people working with children, some people drumming, it was crazy active. But what I realized is that they had managed to find a comfortable place where all of those things could be held in ceremony. So it didn't matter whether you were with the kids or you were sitting listening to the teaching, you were part of it. And what really surprised me was they welcomed me as a Christian minister, and I was in there helping build the Initiates Lodge, the whole business. There was no sense of my being an outsider, even though it's not my culture and it wasn't my spiritual tradition. And I found that openness in their rituals all along. So whether it was a new moon ceremony or the naming ceremony, I was welcome. And at a time of great difficulty in my own life, they came to me and said, we think you need your name because you've forgotten who you are. And so an elder who was a leader in the Medewan Lodge, I gave him tobacco. He went off and dreamed and came back with my name. And it was incredibly humbling because in the ritual, the name is presented to all 6 directions, north, south, east, west, heavenward, earthward. And then the people gathered to speak to the name. Now, I was mortified when I heard the name because I thought, good Lord, that's not me. But I sat and listened to people I didn't even know talk about what they had observed about me in the community and spoke to that name. So Skanandam, which is clear mind. What an incredible gift that was, and what a humbling gift it was. So what I would say, Susan, it was the openness, the willingness to walk with, far more so than the Christian church usually is, that really opened my eyes.
Thank you.
Well, if anyone has any questions, please let us know, but we'll move on with the rest of our presentation.
Jay,
I want
Jay,
to
there's
take-
a question in the chat.
Okay. I'm sorry, I don't see that. If
don't
someone
you?
who can see it could read it.
Oh, does anyone else see? Do you see it, Teresa?
No, but if you would read it to me, that would be
Sure.
great.
Oh, I see. She sent it to me directly. Okay.
Okay, just read
So
it to me.
I will read it. Teresa, could you please comment on the difference in the meaning of time for Indigenous people and timed Christian settler cultures?
Absolutely. That's a big one. I could have gone off on all on its own. We talk about time as chronology, chronos, where Indigenous culture and numerous South American, African communities have a similar approach to time, and that's Kairos time. It's relational time. So time takes what it will take. So for example, when I first got to Christian Island, I asked what time worship started, and they said 11 o'clock. So I was ready to go at 11 o'clock and away we went. And I think there were 3 people in the building, no, 4. That would be the accompanist, my partner, myself, and the one white school teacher on the island. Nobody else was in worship. And at about quarter after, they would come rolling in. And this happened week after week. And so I finally said, look, do you want to start worship at 11:15? And they looked at me like I had 3 heads. And they said, well, no, worship starts at 11. That's when we leave our houses. Because the walking to church and the communal time and meeting up with the neighbors was equally important to what was going on in the service. It's relational time. It takes what it takes. So that, yeah, when you're doing worship that way, worship can be a couple of hours. It takes what it takes. But Chronos and Kairos. And yeah, it's a huge problem. It's one of the crazy making things for me is when the National Indigenous Council gathers, we have to gather in a Zoom meeting, which starts at a particular time and ends at a particular time. But there's this incredible drift in and out of the meetings. And you just have to learn to accept that not everybody is working on the same understanding of time. Does that help?
It's a start.
Yeah.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Carol, for bringing to our attention the question in the chat. It didn't appear on my screen, and I apologize to whoever sent the message that I didn't pick it up. It's now the time that we close the questions, and I wanted to take just a moment to thank Anita from York for all the help that she's given to us to stage this event. Not only has she helped to run the technical aspect of things here, but also she met with us and helped us plan the event. And then after we had the bit of a plan, she helped us promote it. And I think the turnout here with around 100 or more, we're just thrilled with the participation and the interest that people have shown. Over to you, Sue, for the thanks.
Sue, can I just say one thing?
Yes,
Yes,
please.
please.
I'd like to thank everyone who took the time to spend with me this evening. This is the first time I've been able to share publicly the work and I really appreciate the time and the intentionality you spent in giving of your evening. So thank you.
And Teresa, we'd like to thank you. I believe that we've all enjoyed hearing your insights about the gifts of Indigenous worship for settler churches. We're all enriched and enlivened by your research, ideas, and experience. Indigenous people, spirituality, and culture have endured for thousands of years. Settler churches and all of us living on land that's been lovingly cared for by Indigenous people need to open our hearts and minds to the teachings of our Indigenous sisters and brothers. You are helping us walk into right relations. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
And now I'd like to ask Nathan to say a few words about our new Writing Relations Network.
Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. Nathan Golden Hiatsi, Wenda Shiamis Kwawi Wakusha Endi, Hianyo Hian Iwa Hityo Kuta, Ottawa Woodruff United Church Ekwahiechti. As a member of the Writing Relations Network, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending this evening. We're grateful for your presence amongst us, but first and foremost, I'd like to thank Teresa Burnett-Cole, Miigwech, Niawen, Kiawankinai, without whom this evening wouldn't have been possible. And I'd like to thank her for sharing her teachings, her wisdom, and the theme of her thesis with us this evening. I'd also like to thank all of you who have taken part in setting this up and making sure that everything runs smoothly. We got there. As you now know, EORC has a new network where UCC congregants, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can share resources, ideas, ask questions, and coordinate learning opportunities in all matters dealing with right relations. As congregations actively respond to the call to action number 59 to educate themselves in all things that pertain to the Indian Act, the UN Charter of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, as well as coming to terms with the impact of colonization and European cultures on Indigenous peoples, there's been a need in this region for a hub where these important matters can be discussed, studied, and applied. Some members of our network got together for the first time in the spring of 2019 when some of us initiated a study of the calls to the church, the Indigenous Church's vision for itself within the United Church of Canada, followed by a discussion on a book regarding land acknowledgements with the gracious help and coaching of Jane Dawson at the time. With the help of Reverend Peter Bartlett, we've been working hard to discern our call and our vision as a network. We all agreed that we are first and foremost very humble learners, and we'd like to invite each and every one of you to join us on our journey. We welcome diverse voices, both rural and urban, young and not so young, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. For more information, you can write to us at writingrelationsnetwork@gmail.com. So again, it's writingrelationsnetwork, all in one word, small caps, @gmail.com. Niawen, Miigwech, Tiawank, thank you and merci for choosing to spend this evening with us. We look forward to interacting with you in the future. Ona, Shia Esquahia.
And we'd like to ask Janet Thompson to say a final blessing.
Thank you. We have been given the opportunity tonight for deep listening, and we have been blessed by our time together. We have been blessed by Teresa's sharing of her wisdom. We are blessed because we seek to bring Jesus' vision of compassion and caring into the world. Let us take these grace-filled blessings and share them now and always. Amen.
Good night, everyone. Thanks a lot for spending this time with us.
Thank
It was
you.
wonderful. Thank you.
It was wonderful. Very
Thank
blessed.
you.
Feel very blessed.